Hey everyone, welcome to the channel. I hope you're doing well. And if you're new here, what we do on Unfortunate Ends is talk about people who've had tragic or unfortunate ends to their life. Anyway, let's jump into today's video. When the Mexican War of Independence broke out in 1808, the military commander Agustin de Iturbide elected to fight on the side of the Spanish colonial government against the rebels. But by a remarkable series of events, shortly after the war ended in 1821, he was crowned as the first Emperor of Mexico in May 1822. Over the next tumultuous 26 months, he was subsequently deposed, went into exile, returned to Mexico, was quickly arrested, and was then executed. This is the story of the first Emperor of Mexico. Agustin de Iturbide was born on the 23rd of September 1783 as Agustin Cosme Damian de Iturbide y Aramburu in Valladolid ni Morelia, in the Mexican state of Michoacán. He was born into an esteemed family which had been part of the Aragonese nobility of northeastern Spain, going back to the 15th century. However, Agustin's father, José Joaquín, was a younger member of this noble family. As a result, with his prospects somewhat limited at home in Iberia, he decided to migrate to New Spain to carve out a life for himself there. He soon married María de Figueroa, a criolla, or pure Spanish-blooded Mexican. As such, Agustin was born into an inherently Spanish family within New Spain in the late 18th century. His early life reflected his upbringing in that he sought out a career in the military, a common route for those who hailed from a wealthy or noble background in the Spanish colonies. He joined the Royalist army in his teens, and by 1806, when he was just 23 years of age, he had been promoted to a full lieutenant. The previous year, he had married Ana María Josefa Ramona de Huarte y Muñiz, a member of the extremely wealthy Tagle family, the head of which held the title of Marquess of Altamira. In the 17th century, the Tagle family had been the wealthiest in the entire Spanish dominions. Hence, by the mid-1800s, Iturbide was both a rising figure within the Mexican army and an established member of the colonial nobility. This was the personal context for Agustin in which the Mexican War of Independence erupted. Spain's vast colonial empire had been weakening for over a century, as the country stagnated back in Europe, and places such as Mexico, Peru, Colombia, and Argentina became eager for independence. The opportunity to finally make this reality arrived in the early 19th century when Spain became a vassal state of France during the Napoleonic Wars, which raged across Europe between 1803 and 1815. Invasion of the Iberian Peninsula by the British from 1807 onwards, the so-called Peninsular War, robbed Spain of the ability to defend its overseas colonies, should independence movements arise there. This was compounded by a decision by Napoleon to launch his own military foray into Spain in 1808. Accordingly, in the late 1800s and into the 1810s, Spanish colonial subjects, all the way from modern-day Texas through North and Central America to Argentina and Chile, in the south of the continent, would attempt to free themselves from Spanish rule. The Mexican War of Independence began in 1808 and would last until 1821. It was not a singular conflict, with the two sides opposing each other, but had many moving parts, with some sides favouring Mexican independence, others trying to preserve Spanish colonial rule, and others still attempting to have Mexico acquire its independence while maintaining its links to the Spanish monarchy and traditional Spanish values, such as the power of the Roman Catholic Church within the country. Moreover, it was further complicated by regional divisions. For instance, the regions in the south of Central America, which today constitute countries such as Honduras and Costa Rica, were then joined with Mexico, though they would split at the end of the War of Independence. Iturbide was soon involved in the conflict. In 1810, he was offered a senior military position within the rebel forces, but he declined. A committed monarchist and traditionalist, he was unwilling to join the revolutionary forces. Thus, he spent the next several years fighting effectively to maintain some form of Spanish colonial rule. However, his methods as a military commander came under strong criticism. Several atrocities against civilians were levelled against him, and there seems little doubting that there was substance to these accusations. For instance, on Good Friday of 1814, he had 300 rebels executed without any reference to the courts. He was also accused of corruption in his role as a senior military commander. Accordingly, in 1816 he was relieved of his command for abuses of office, though this lasted just 12 months before he was reinstated as the military situation for the colonial regime became graver following the rise to power of Vicente Guerrero as the Republican rebel leader in the mid-1810s. In tandem, Iturbide's political views were shifting in the mid-1810s. He increasingly believed that Spain could no longer retain control over most of its overseas colonies, but he wished for Mexico to retain ties to the homeland, a not uncommon political stance for an individual with strong ties to the Spanish nobility. Furthermore, he increasingly conceived of a situation in which King Ferdinand VII, the King of Spain since 1808, might be offered the throne of Mexico in a new monarchy, which would be otherwise largely independent of Spain. This would be a situation akin to how the British Commonwealth would develop in later times, with individual colonies acquiring their independence, but maintaining their ties in terms of having a common monarch. It was believed that Ferdinand VII would be particularly in favour of this dispensation, as he had lost an enormous amount of power at home in Spain, and this new position in Mexico might offer an opportunity to rejuvenate the monarchy. This position would characterise Iturbide's political views for the next 5 years. In line with his desire to stem the progress of the Republican and Liberal movement, in 1820, Iturbide began building a coalition of disparate elements in the War of Independence. This was designed to achieve independence from Spain, but while preserving a relatively conservative regime, which would renounce the more extreme aspects of the independence movement and their politics. In the course of building such a coalition, Agustin had to negotiate with individuals he had been implacably opposed to throughout the 1810s. The outcome of all of this is what is known as the Plan of Iguala. On the 24th of February 1821, Iturbide, in conjunction with the rebel leader Vicente Guerrero, promulgated a political agreement which they had been working on for some time. The Plan of Iguala, or the Plan of the Three Guarantees, established 3 central principles which the rebels led by Guerrero and the conservative monarchists, increasingly led by Iturbide, could agree upon. These in brief were that Roman Catholicism and the Roman Catholic Church would be given a position of primacy within an independent Mexico. Secondly, Mexico would have absolute political independence, free from Spain or any other power. And finally, full political, social, and economic rights were granted to all Mexican citizens. There would be no distinction between those of pure Spanish blood and those of mixed race in the newly independent Mexico. The plan did not lead to an automatic end to the conflict, but many of its key principles were signed into law on the 24th of August 1821 by both de Iturbide and the Spanish Viceroy Juan O'Donoghue. The Treaty of Córdoba, as their agreement has become known, effectively instituted Mexico's independence. But the conservative nature of it was clear. The treaty called for Ferdinand VII to be offered the crown of Mexico, independent of his monarchical duties in Spain. This latter scheme, though, would never materialize, as Ferdinand refused to take up the position, instead entertaining the wild hopes that Spain could reconquer its colonies in Central and North America and reunite his disparate dominions. In light of this, a remarkable series of events now occurred. In the early summer of 1822, after protracted negotiations in the new Mexican Congress about what path forward an independent Mexico should take, widespread public rallies began calling for Iturbide to be proclaimed head of a Mexican empire. The very next day, the Mexican Congress ratified this proposal. Consequently, the general who had fought to maintain Spanish monarchical control over Mexico in the 1810s suddenly found himself proclaimed as Emperor Agustin I of Mexico on the 19th of May 1822. Scholars have debated widely whether Iturbide actually had long-standing ambitions to rule Mexico, but the evidence points more towards Agustin simply falling into this position owing to a peculiar series of events in 1821 and early 1822. We might consider his accession, and with it, the proclamation of the First Mexican Empire, a strange coincidence of the indecision which surrounded the future of Mexico at the end of the War of Independence. Whatever the particular circumstances of Iturbide's accession as Agustin I of Mexico were, we do know that his reign was to prove extremely short-lived. Iturbide was plagued immediately by a number of very serious issues as he sought to govern Mexico. The state was bankrupt at a time when tens of thousands of soldiers needed to be paid off in order to bring the fighting to an end. A number of regional revolts continued to rage, and many elements on the left and centre in the Mexican Congress remained unreconciled to the new political arrangement. Facing mounting opposition, he elected to suspend the Congress in October 1822, just 5 months after his accession. In the weeks that followed, the support of the Mexican army melted away, and by early spring of 1823, he was forced to recall the parliament. Such was the national discontent. Agustin saw that his fate was sealed. On the 19th of March, 10 months to the day after his proclamation as the first Emperor of Mexico, he abdicated, bringing the First Mexican Empire to a swift and humiliating end. The First Mexican Republic would soon follow, but for Agustin, there was to only be a short retirement. In May 1823, he left Mexico on board a ship for Livorno in Italy. He spent the next several months moving about Europe as the Spanish government put pressure on various states to expel him. Eventually, he ended up in England in late 1823, where he published his autobiography, defending his actions and stance in the War of Independence. However, even in exile, the pull of Mexico remained strong, particularly as the new Mexican Republic had found it difficult to stabilize the country itself once Agustin had abdicated. Therefore, in July 1824, he returned to Mexico with the belief that he might be viewed by many Mexican conservatives as a liberator from the tyranny of the Republicans. Iturbide was quickly disabused of this naive notion, and his homecoming was a remarkable failure. He landed at the port of Soto la Marina in the state of Tamaulipas on the 14th of July 1824. Although greeted with some enthusiasm by the locals upon his arrival, he was quickly arrested by the local military commander, one General Felipe de la Garza. A cursory trial was held locally, following which he was executed by a firing squad on the 19th of July, just 5 days after his return to his homeland. His final words declared his admiration both for his homeland and the Roman Catholic faith. Minutes later, he was shot by 3 bullets by the firing squad. In this way, Iturbide's end reflected his beliefs. He was a man who held wholly conservative values about the Spanish monarchy and the position of the Roman Catholic Church. His brief reign was a testament to the disorder of Mexican politics at the end of the War of Independence, and the failed efforts to reconcile the values of the Spanish colony with the new values of a country which wished to be independent and shed its historical chains. The chaos of Mexican politics following independence, of which his reign was just the first part, would last for many decades after his brief time as emperor. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this video on Agustin de Iturbide. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, leave me a like and a comment down below, and if you're new, why not subscribe? If you have any suggestions, be sure to leave them down in the comments. And anyway, that's all from me, so I'll see all of you in the next unfortunate end. Thanks.